Our young people are growing up in multicultural and multi-faith schools and communities. How can we equip them to share confidently about their Christian faith? In the next in our series on equipping young people to share faith, we turn to perhaps a surprising answer. I'm Melanie Cave, Managing Director at Roots, and today I'm speaking to Jill Appleton, National Director of The Feast. She's discovered that by inviting teenagers into interfaith dialogue, they become more confident in their Christian identity and better able to listen and communicate respectfully and with curiosity, skills that make them more willing to have faith conversations in school and throughout their lives. I pose the question, does interfaith dialogue hinder or help in evangelism? See what you think. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Welcome, Jill, to the Roots for Churches podcast. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be here.
So we are doing a series on helping young people to share faith. And I wanted to talk to you because you run an amazing organisation called The Feast. Can you tell me a little bit about The Feast and how you got involved in that?
Yes, this is my favourite bit, telling you all about The Feast. The Feast is a charity that brings young people from different faiths, backgrounds, ethnicities together to talk about faith and belief, to teach young people how to have dialogue, to build bridges between communities, to make friends and to change the world. Just in a little nutshell, we've been a charity for 17 years now, but the work actually started probably about 27 years ago when Andrew Smith, who's our founder, used to work for Scripture Union. And part of his job was going into schools to deliver Christian assemblies, to help schools fulfill their responsibility to have a broadly Christian act of worship every day. And because of the nature of Birmingham, where he worked, some of the schools that he went into would have a large number of Muslim young people in there. And he would always, as a Christian, he would always want to share the gospel. He would always talk about Jesus. And at the end, he would find that there'd be some young people who wanted to tell him he was wrong, who wanted to argue with him, who were angry at what he'd said about Jesus because it didn't coincide with their beliefs. And as he journeyed on through his work and he came across more and more young people, he thought there's got to be a way to talk about faith without it being this huge disagreement, without it actually not coming to blows, but causing people to dislike each other. And inspired, I believe, by God, one day he said to one young man who came up to him, he said, "Tell me what you love most about your faith." And that completely changed the conversation and the dynamic. And by giving this young man of a different faith the opportunity to say what he had to say, giving him the respect and the dignity that a person of any faith, well, anybody deserves, just changed the conversation. And so from that moment, Andrew then, through Scripture Union, actually ran what we call a youth encounter. He brought a group of Christians and Muslim young people together for a day of dialogue and fun events and activities and food. We always have food. And there was a moment during that day where one of the Christian girls said to one of the Muslim girls, you know, some Muslim women wear this full face covering, the niqab. How do you recognize anybody? How do you know who anybody is? And the Muslim girl started to say, well, we recognize people from their eyes and from their makeup. You know, that's what we do. That's fascinating. Did you see what was on EastEnders last night? And but actually, that was a wonderful moment. Because what was created was this space to ask the questions that we often fear might lead to upsetting somebody or offending somebody. Actually, what happens with young people is that they find ways to get to know each other. And by asking that question about EastEnders, it actually, in this particular case, opened the start of an amazing friendship between a Christian and a Muslim girl. And one of the Muslim girls, the Muslim girl, Bushra, is now one of our volunteers. So years later, she is somebody who comes and who works alongside us. The Christian girl she met, she went to her birthday party. She'd never been in the house of a Christian before. And vice versa, the Christian had never been into a Muslim's house before. And so that was the start of this recognition that when you bring young people together, when you give them the tools to talk openly and safely about things they don't agree with, or they may have very different views on, friendship can form from that. And so, you know, what our tagline is, talking faith, making friends, changing lives. And what we see all the time is when we give young people that opportunity to learn from each other, learn about each other, to break down the barriers, to demystify things, to take away the things that they might otherwise fear, and also to show them that narratives they might have bought into are untrue, then that's when real friendship grows. And that's how you create the, you know, better society where people live well together. But I think one of the things that's really, really important and perhaps sets the feast apart is that, yes, we are described as an interfaith charity. I'm not too keen on that word because often the interfaith space is the space where you celebrate the things you have in common. But actually what we do at the feast is we celebrate what we have, what is different. And we help young people learn to live well with difference, because often the things that make us different are the most important things in our lives. And that's our faith. So for Bushra and her friend, the things that made them different were their faiths. And for both of them, their faith was probably the most important thing in their life. So instead of pushing it to one side or not having those difficult conversations, we celebrate that and we help young people live in that space where it's okay to have differences. So yeah, that's what we do at the feast. That's what the feast is about.
It's a fascinating journey, and I think it's interesting, this idea that it came out of somebody sharing faith and then sort of a shift in perspective led to more of a conversational space rather than a debate space. You use this word dialogue. Can you help me understand how dialogue is different to debate, and how can we get better at that? Because as you say, I can feel it in my spirit, like that sense of like, if I'm having a dialogue, I'm kind of on the same side as you, or I'm sitting with you, I'm conversing. Debate, we're definitely opposing, and we're trying to score points and win. With sharing faith, particularly with people with very differing beliefs, different religions, it does feel like we're on opposite sides quite often. How do we get to that point where it feels like a dialogue, where it doesn't feel so confrontational or combative?
You've really touched on it there, because the world that our young people live in is exactly that world. They're surrounded by loud voices, and the loudest voice often wins. You know, it's no coincidence that the word for someone on social media is an influencer, and their purpose is to persuade you to think the same as them, or buy the same things as them, or do the same things as them. And, you know, young people are surrounded by that. For 30 years, I was an English teacher, and I loved running debates in my classroom, you know, and I'd say, you lot are on this side and you're on that side, and persuade each other to change. And there's a place for that, you know, and I love a good debate. But you don't really learn much in a debate, because you're spending all your time waiting for the silence so you can dive in and say what you've got to say.
Mm.
And the way we teach dialogue, because we are very mindful about teaching young people how to have dialogue. We don't just say we're just going to have a conversation. We spend time teaching them how to have that conversation in a safe space, a space where you don't make assumptions about one another, where the object isn't to convince somebody else they're wrong and you're right, where no one is allowed to assume authority over somebody else. So often in a conversation, and I have young people tell me this all the time, they're always being told, oh, you're a Muslim, tell us what Muslims believe about this, or you're a Christian, you believe this, don't you? And that last one particularly is the assuming authorities. I know better than you what you think. And those are not those sorts of attitudes aren't conducive to learning about one another and having a really good conversation. And what dialogue does, and I know actually its true meaning is the conversation between two people, but I think where we hold it at the feast is that dialogue is that safe space where you're free to ask questions about really tricky or difficult or challenging topics, talk about those topics, talk about what you think, without feeling that you are having to stand up for everybody in your faith. You're not the spokesperson for all of Christianity. We use a tool called the Guidelines for Dialogue, and there are 10 guidelines that we teach young people. They're non-negotiable. And the reason they're non-negotiable is because I remember saying to Andrew, who started the feast, who wrote these many years ago, I said, you know, as a teacher, we often negotiate the rules for a conversation, rules in a classroom. He said, that's all well and good. But if you said to young people, what are going to be 10 good rules for dialogue? They're not going to come up with speak positively about your own faith rather than negatively about somebody else's, which is one of our guidelines. They will say, listen to each other. They might say, be honest. So listen to what everyone has to say is one of our guidelines. Be honest in what you say is another. But they're not necessarily, and I'm not doing anyone a disservice because these have been well thought through, going to think about that one about don't treat someone as a spokesperson for their faith or culture or gender. So we are really deliberate in teaching those guidelines. And we spend a lot of time on each of them, particularly the first one, which is listen to what everyone has to say. And I alluded to this earlier because really good listening is not the listening where you're waiting for someone to take a breath so you can dive in with what you have to say. Really good listening is demonstrated by what you say when someone stops talking. It's that's really interesting. I've got a completely different view. Can you explain that to me? Or I never thought of something like that. Why did you say such and such? And it is about teaching young people. And I have to say, every time I talk about these, people say, oh, we could use those in our staff room. We could use those in our PCC.
In our marriages, in our friendships, in our parenting.
Exactly. And they cross all of that, which I just love them. They're the most powerful tool. One of my staff once described them as gold dust. But the listen one particularly is such a good example of how you have to break them down. You have to explain to young people what they mean. And then you have to give them the opportunity to practice that.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'll practice that with quite simple questions. Like, what's your favorite time of the year? Or, day of the week, or anything, any question that gets them talking to one another, but saying to them, when that person stops talking, ask them a follow-up question. And it feels like it is a process. And a lot of the young people that come to the feast journey with us on this, but equally we'll do a one-off in school with the guidelines for dialogue, and they will have one or two of them, if not all, will have an impact on them and make them think about, oh, this is how we talk to one another. So, so there are those 10, and they're at the heart of everything we do. So if we might just focus on one for the purpose of an activity that we're doing. We took a group of young people to our cathedral in Birmingham. There's a wonderful stained glass exhibition. Well, not exhibition, the stained glass windows are there, but there are various activities that they can do there. And our focus on that day was make every effort to get along with everyone, regardless of their faith, gender, ethnicity, or age. Because actually what we were hoping would come out of that was not just that young people would go into a cathedral and discover there's some beautiful stained glass and this is what a cathedral looks like, but actually have that opportunity to say, well, in my place of worship, it looks like this, or this would be how we would pray in our place of worship, or we don't have any pictures in our place of worship, or we have these colours. Just actually finding out from everyone something about them based on the place that they were in at the time.
Yeah. As you're talking, what's going through my mind is that we started this by saying this is a series on sharing faith, but what you're actually saying is we need to get better at listening. And it's kind of in reverse. We often think, how can we get somebody else to listen to what I believe? How can I communicate? It's all about me talking, whether it's visual or whether it's an argument or a debate or a tract or however people have communicated, or even if it's like I'm going to serve and do these actions, I'm communicating about God. Very few of us think about sharing faith as listening. And I think that's a complete reversal of the way that we've been taught about evangelism. But as you say, it creates a safer space and it creates honor and it builds relationship. Now, some people might say, well, time is limited. We can't spend all the time just listening to other people. Is that not platforming their ideas, which we may not agree with? Will we run out of time? I think this is the underlying feeling in a debate. Sometimes it's like, if you get all the airtime, people are going to listen to you. And I need to make sure that my argument is more convincing and I've got more airtime. I'm the louder voice. Our culture is very geared up for that. How do we change that within us and even in how we share faith so that we have more trust, more confidence that people will ask the questions once they've been listened to, or trust that they'll be interested in hearing about us after they've shared about them? I think we worry that people won't ask us back.
No, and actually that's why the guidelines for dialogue are so important, because listening's massively important, but so is, these are just some of them, acknowledging the similarities and differences between our faiths. So that opens the door to say, that's really interesting what you said. Let me tell you what I think. And we see that happening all the time. You know, one of the guidelines, don't tell others what they believe, let them tell you. So often young people say to me, please, can I give these to my RE teacher? I'm fed up with them saying, you believe this, don't you? But actually, this is why teaching people about dialogue, which is two-way, not one-way, is so important, because it's in the listening to one another and then having that opportunity to talk about yourselves that actually we see young people start to form their beliefs, or to really work through, what do I think? What do I believe? So what I would say is, how do you do it is you teach people how to have dialogue. You know, we change that landscape that young people live in. And that's what we do at the feast. And what we see all the time is that there are sometimes young people who just sit there quietly, just listening. There are some young people who find that situation difficult. But later we'll say over lunch, you said this. And or one of the other young people, actually, this is more important. One of the other young people will say, you've not said anything. What do you think? Tell us what you think. Or, you know, what did you see on telly last night? Just having a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and that's this art of conversation is really lost. So much of what young people do is on text, on screen. And I remember whenever we run an encounter, which is where we bring young people of different faiths together, and often young people with no faith as well, they always know we never pretend we're going rock climbing and having some food. Come and have some fun. We always say we're going rock climbing, we're going to eat together, and we're going to have really good dialogue about. I'm going to talk about faith. So we're always really open and honest about what we do. And I remember one occasion we'd had lunch. I said, and I just said, okay, come on, everybody, we're going to get you into groups for dialogue. And one of the young people, and he doesn't mind me naming him because we've talked about this, he said, dialogue, do we have to? And we had a researcher with us, and he said, don't you enjoy the dialogue? He said, oh, I do. I always get so much out of it. It's just the thought of having to sit down and do it that annoys me. But, but he is the first to acknowledge he gets so much out of it.
Yeah.
Of course, he wanted to go off and do whatever activity we were doing at the time, but he recognizes the value in that. And when you see young people having this journey together of learning how to talk, learning how to ask questions about each other, and it is intentional on our part to make this happen, then they become more confident, more able to talk about their faith and their identity, because they work through that in this process. And, one of the things that does then is it gives them a model that they repeat in different places. So I know when my daughter went off to university, and my daughter doesn't have a faith, but she's been involved in the feast almost as long as I have. She was horrified by the racism that she was hearing from her fellow flatmates. And so she just took herself back to the guidelines for dialogue, and she started having conversations. So she was challenging what they thought, but sort of creating that space where they could have conversation. And I'm so proud of her. They became the flat that played board games on a Saturday night rather than going out clubbing, because they got on, the friendships that were developed, not exclusively because of my daughter, but I do believe in part, were because she brought her experience of that life is better when we can talk to one another and we can be open with one another in a way that isn't threatening, isn't going to put somebody down, but actually gives us that space to say, this is what I think, and this is why I don't agree with you, but in a healthy way.
And it's that way of having these really perhaps difficult conversations, meaningful conversations without falling out with people. And I think that skill, gosh, if you look at our politicians, if you look at everything going on in the world, people seem to not know how to disagree with someone and still be respectful and still see their humanity as a person. That's really lost. So if we can equip young people with that, that's incredible. And as you say, that will transform society. But how have you seen these tools for dialogue, this methodology of feast, help perhaps Christian young people with their faith? Or have you seen people in these conversations go on a journey of faith?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the things that I realized quite early on when I started at the feast was that the kind of questions that we pose, because we also give them the topics to talk about. Because if you said to young people, go and have a conversation, they just look at you like you were mad. And, you know, that within the content, within a set of questions, there may be a question that says, how does your faith help you deal with, or what do your scriptures tell you about? And some young people are really confident in their scriptures, you know, particularly a lot of the Muslim young people that we work with, they go to mosque school on Saturdays, often most days of the week, perhaps after school. But I often see with Christian young people that they don't have the grounding in the Bible that perhaps their peers in the Muslim faith may do. And I remember one young man in particular, and again, I'm allowed to tell his story. We have his permission. His name is Chauncey, and he came to the feast, literally, his mum's words, kicking and screaming. He didn't want to come along. He went to church kicking and screaming. His mum was lovely Christian lady, is a lovely Christian lady, and Chauncey hated being taken to church, but he came to the feast. And it was the first day of a week of activities during one of the holidays. We were baking, so we were making snickerdoodles, which are cinnamon cookies. We have an American volunteer, and also gulab jamun, the little donuts that you do in syrup, and they made those together. And then in our dialogue session, the first question was, what are the similarities and differences between what you cooked? And then another one was, what are the similarities and differences between our faiths? And Chauncey looked like he wanted the world to open up beneath him, because he didn't want to have this conversation. But Uzair, one of our a young Muslim folk who was coming at the time, who'd been coming long enough, he absolutely got the guidelines for dialogue. He knew how to have conversations. And he said to Chauncey, I don't know if you know, but in Islam, in our scriptures, Jesus is in our scriptures. This is what we call him, and this is what we think. What do you believe about Jesus? And again, Chauncey looked at me as if to say, please, will you answer the question for me? I don't want to talk. And I didn't. And he said a few bits and pieces. But something happened that day to Chauncey. For a start, he came the rest of the week. He was adamant that he wanted to come and be involved, and he stayed involved. But he'd been brought by one of our Methodist partners. She'd encouraged Mum to bring him along. Chauncey clearly at that point thought, I actually don't know what I think. I don't know what I believe. Fast forward less than 6 months, and Chauncey was speaking at the Methodist, is it 3Gen conference?
3Generate.
Yeah. About the feast and what his journey with the feast had done, and how it had encouraged him to learn more about his faith and to go back to church. I actually met his minister, and I was telling this story, and he went, I know who you're talking about. He said, he's a different person. Because, you know, we don't often talk about faith. It's, you know, in some families, it's a taboo subject, apart from in RE at school, which often is delivered by folk who don't have a faith themselves and don't really know how to conduct those kinds of conversations. Isn't that opportunity. But because he was asked a question by someone of a different faith, what it did for him was encourage him to find out more about his own faith and to become stronger in his faith and to go to church more willingly. I'm not saying we saw we did see a transformed young man, but we saw a young man who also liked to go out with his mates and have fun. You know, it
didn't change his personality as such.
He was able to have fun with friends of different faiths and backgrounds. Chauncey is black, and his mum had always worried about how if she allowed him to go to school or to go to these sorts of things, he could be led down a really bad path. You know, it's a fear a lot of parents have of their child living in particular areas. But actually, it gave her the confidence to allow Chauncey to go out more and to be more involved with friends and in society. But he wanted to talk about his experience, and that was a young man who hadn't even wanted to come along. But you know, in the context of the feast, I take as much joy when I see that experience for Hindu young people or Muslim young people, where actually they become more confident and more clear about their own beliefs, because what that creates for them is a resilience, and that's a resilience that helps them stand against any form of radicalisation, any overdue influence. But it enables young people just to be confident in their identity, not to feel they have to hide who they are, but actually say, this is who I am, this is my faith, and this is how I'm going to behave.
So do the guidelines for dialogue help you to recognize radicalization or recognize the unhealthy influences? Because we talked a bit about like influencing and debate, and I think sometimes the radicalization messages, they do come from a particular perspective, but once you get sucked in, it feels like some sort of part of your religion or some sort of part of your culture. So it piggybacks on stuff that you already think and believe. How would being good at this dialogue or these guidelines help you recognize radicalization and avoid it?
I think one of the things that they do is they first of all help you think about, what do I believe and why do I believe that? Where has that come from? Has it come from the my faith and my faith leaders? Has it come from my family? Has it come from things I've heard or other influences? And so actually what the process young people go through is, why do I think this? And what is the justification for it? And in a school context, that's really, really important. And, particularly as schools have to be really aware of the prevent agenda and how to sort of signpost and flag things up. And perhaps an example, one of the things that was recognized about our work on developing identity and thinking about faith was that how it does counter the voices of radicalization. And particularly one of the projects that we were involved in is reducing violence, with one particular funding we had, reducing violence against women and girls. And what we saw by teaching, most of the groups we worked with were boys, although we did work with small girls groups because there's a lot of girl on girl violence as well that we came across. But there was one particular day when we were talking about what makes us think this about people. Why do we feel this way about this? And one of the lads in the group said, "Why? Well, what I don't get is, why is it all right for girls to hit us, but we're not allowed to hit girls?" And I know that's not related to what we're talking about specifically, but actually the space was created for him to ask a question, because clearly he was thinking about, well, why do I think the way I do? If other people do this, why is it not okay for this? And why is it okay for that? So it's creating a space where young people are not only questioning each other, but they question themselves, and they're thinking about, what do I think? Can I tell? Because this really was about somebody who'd been radicalized. A couple of years ago, changed my very old car for a not so old car in one of these car supermarket places, and I have a feast sign on my car. And the young man who was serving my daughter with me, he said, "What's the feast?" At which point my daughter went, "We're never going to go away." But I started to tell him, and he stopped me, and he said, "Actually, I know what the feast is." And he called his boss over, and he said, "The feast is this lady works for the organization that saved my life. If it wasn't for the feast, I would either be dead or in prison now."
Wow.
Now, this is Manny, who grew up in Handsworth, which is an area of Birmingham at a time. So he actually came on the feast's very first residential, so 17 odd years ago. And at the time, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of antagonism between the Black and the Asian community, particularly the Black and the Muslim community in Handsworth. And Manny had grown up, he'd been brought up as a Christian, but he turned his back on his faith. He was very much engaged in the sort of fringes of a gang. He had totally bought into the narrative that all Muslims are evil, and his life was on a really awful trajectory. And he said to me, "I have no idea how my mum persuaded me to go on this weekend." I'm thinking, no, I think God had a bit to do with that. But he went on the weekend, and they took the boys climbing and cycling and all that sort of stuff. But they taught them the guidelines for dialogue. They had dialogue over the course of the weekend. And I think it was probably the Sunday morning at breakfast, he found himself having a real laugh with the lad next to him. And the wake up for him was that this lad was a Muslim, somebody who he had been radicalized to believe was somebody who was evil, who was a threat, who he couldn't be friends with, and realized in that moment that he'd bought into a narrative that was a lie. So that experience of having dialogue, of having the opportunity to meet with people who are different, but also to start to think about, why do I think like this, changed his life.
Yeah. I can see that. I can see how it totally disrupted the pattern he was on just by that encounter, which was relational.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating. So it feels like it's a reconciliation, a peace building resource. But is there something in Feast that is a resource about sharing faith? I guess it's a sharing faith in a very open ended, I'm going to tell you about mine, you tell me about yours. And I suppose in that setting, we worry that maybe the Christian message won't be as compelling as a Hindu or a Muslim or an atheistic worldview. And we worry that our young people in that very open-ended setting will choose something different.
That's a very real fear that people have. And I know in the early days of the feast, some churches were really reluctant, didn't want their young people to be involved because of the risk to them. And that transfers to people of other faiths as well.
Yeah, yeah.
We see that in other faiths, and that's certainly been the experience that we've had recently with we've had our first Hindu young people come and join us. And I remember when their mum ticked the consent box, filled the form in, one of the questions was, it is always, well, can we keep you on our database? Can we let you know about other events? And she firmly ticked no, because she was suspicious and she wasn't confident. The girls have now been coming to us frequently, and one of them is one of our young leaders. There is a hesitancy on all people's part that when you do something like this, there is a risk that someone will change their mind. But because we are taking out of the equation, you have to convince somebody that you're right and they're wrong. We have never, ever seen anybody change their faith or decide to convert to a different faith or walk away from faith. What we see is young people become more confident in their own faith because we provide a space where they can talk about it that is different to evangelism. Now, I'm a Christian, and I believe that there is only one way to God, and that's through Jesus. And in other places and other contexts, I was part of the leadership team of my church. I was a licensed lay reader. That's part of my life that's really important to me, sharing the gospel, talking to people about Jesus. But the place at the feast is not the place for evangelism. It's the place for building up young people to become confident in their faith and to become those people. And it's, we do have a resource actually specifically for Christian youth workers to use with Christian young people, because one of the things that we realized quite early on was how often Christian young people aren't as grounded in their scriptures as perhaps friends from the Muslim faith may be. I mean, it's a different case with young people from the Sikh and the Hindu faith. Certainly in the Sikh faith, you hear your scriptures, you don't read them, you don't necessarily have a copy of your holy book at home. But it did concern me that, and the number of Christian young people, including my own godchildren, who would say, I just don't know the Bible well enough. When I'm asked a question, and we ask that question, what do your scriptures say about? Or what do you believe about? Or how does your faith help you with this? For some young people, a bit like Chauncey, although his experience was a bit different, he just hadn't wanted to be involved in church. They don't have those answers. And so, but what we see is young people thinking, well, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to go and have to find out what the answer is. And if we direct anyone, we always direct them to their family first and then their church or faith leaders. We would always steer someone clear of Google and social media. But in the group of young people who are talking with one another, there will be other Christians, there will be other Muslims. So the Christians are learning from other Christians, the Muslims are learning from Muslims. It's a reciprocal thing. But what's taken away is this need in that space to say, well, I need to tell you about this because you need to believe this. What the feast does is it helps young people become so confident in their faith that they can say, and in their own identity, they can say, do you know, I don't know, but next time we meet, I'll tell you what I think. That's a huge talent, a huge gift to give somebody. It's a skill that we want young people to have and direct them in the right place. But the truth is that when young people of different faiths get to know one another well and acknowledge that there are similarities, but there are also some big differences, what we're doing is we're helping young people live in the world that they live in. And when they're at school, they may not even have the choice of who they sit next to in a classroom. So how do they talk to somebody they're placed next to if they come from a different faith and they've never, ever spoken to anybody about faith? How do they when they go to university, navigate a space if they haven't had that opportunity to really explore their faith in different ways. One of the things that I do that I've been involved in is working with the University of Birmingham nurses, their student nurses, and teaching them the guidelines for dialogue. And the very first session I do with them, and I usually have between 70 and 100 in the lecture theatre, I can see that they have self-segregated, that you can identify the groups that they come from by who they've naturally drifted towards. And this is in their first week at university. And by the end of the day, I challenge them about that, because they can't choose which patients they're going to look after.
Yeah.
They can't say, I'm a Christian, I can only work with Christians, or I'm a white Christian, my patients can only be. The real world out there is full of people who they have to work alongside. And that's the place you start from.
Mm.
As Christians, we're called to love our neighbor. And, many people interpret that as we just have to bring those neighbors to Christ. And that is part of loving your neighbor. If we love Jesus, we want other people to know him and love him. But actually, I think Jesus' message about loving our neighbor is really powerful. It isn't about respecting our neighbor. It's not waving over the garden fence at them. It's not tolerating them. It's loving them. It's coming alongside them. It's standing with them when their community is being persecuted. It's standing with them when someone in their family is ill. Not because that may give us an opportunity to tell them about the gospel, but because we're called to genuinely love our neighbor, not for ulterior motive. And I think that's the space that the feast sits in, because when neighbors genuinely get on well together, then we live in the kind of world that I think God rejoices in. 2 years, we have had so many schools contacting us because they have not known how to help their young people navigate the impact of the world conflicts, particularly the issues in Israel and Palestine, but also how they manage the far right protests, the flag, which is huge in Birmingham at the moment. How do we help young people talk about that without it turning into an argument? So many schools are shutting those conversations down because they are frightened of how do we negotiate that. So if we get young people, young Christians, young Muslims, young Sikhs, young Hindus, young people of no faith, who know how to live well with people who are different to them, then we will live in the kind of world that I think it would be better for all of us. We have, the feast is recognised for what we do in quite high places. So we often have government ministers come out and see us. And I always make sure we've got young people there, because they've got a much more powerful voice than I have. And actually they model what really good friendship between people who are different looks like. But they always say, we're always asked the question, what would you like us to take back to Westminster? And and it's happened a few times, but I remember the first time one of the young people held up the guidelines for dialogue like this and said, you need to make sure every member of parliament has a copy of these, because our country would be a better place if our politicians used the guidelines for dialogue. And another one said, and get them in every school, because these have enabled me to be the confident Christian, the confident Sikh, the confident Muslim that I am. I've learned how to do this, and do this in a healthy way.
Amazing. And I think you're right. It is shaping the world that we want to live in, a place where we can peacefully have conversations about things that we disagree about. Like, it's a big world and we all have different areas of interest or areas of concern. Politicians have it very hard trying to balance the concerns of a very diverse population. I get it. I guess my question is, if we are equipping our young people with these skills for dialogue, if we are equipping them to be confident in their own faith, if we're equipping them to really love their neighbours, to stand with them, outside of the context of feast, outside of those conversations, how does that flow into evangelism? So if you took yourself back into your church context, how does this learning, how do these values impact the way that you share faith when you're not in an interfaith setting?
I think I listen better. I have become a much better listener than I ever was before. Perhaps I preface this with, when I started working for the feast, it felt to me like I'd finally found the place I'd been looking for. I started out my career as a teacher of religious education. I became a Christian in my late teens. So I'd never heard the word non-Christian before that point either, because there was very much pressure on me to only have friends who were Christians. And I was like, that's ridiculous. I need to be friends with other people. Well, I am friends with other people. It just was natural.
Yeah.
I like people. And coming to the feast and finding these guidelines for dialogue actually felt to me like almost it was part of my growing spiritual journey. I didn't go on to become a lay reader till long after I joined the feast. I didn't become as involved in my church until after I'd started at the feast. Because my personal faith grew and became stronger because of the conversations I was also having and the experience that I was having.
Yeah.
So it enabled me this process that I also went through, that all my staff go through.
Yeah.
It enabled me to live differently in all aspects of my life.
Yeah.
And to be able to talk more, just more passionately, to understand why I was talking to somebody better, but also to listen to them. Because I think with evangelism, our God speaks for himself. He speaks through us. Thank you, Holy Spirit, that sometimes things that come out of my mouth are heard better by somebody than they necessarily have come out of my mouth. But I think for me, learning to love really what it means to love my neighbor, and why, where I sit in that space has enabled me and empowered me to talk more powerfully about my own faith in the other contexts of my life. And they're not separate. As a team at the feast, and we're a team of different faiths, we've been going through a real struggle financially, and we pray, and God has answered those prayers massively. I mean, it's been quite a journey this year. So I know that God loves the work that we do at the feast as much as he loves it when I'm talking to a friend about Jesus, as much as he loved it when I stood up and preached in church.
Yeah.
This is something that is valued and has God's hand on, and is built on that principle of love your neighbor. So, I can only talk about my own journey, but I am spiritually more nourished because of the journey I've gone on with peace, because of my relationship with my staff of different faiths who are my friends, they're my family. And, to find a space where I can confidently say to one of my Muslim staff, I heard a sermon at the weekend. It's the sermon about where Jesus is preaching on the shore of Galilee, and he gets Peter to give him or Simon, as he's then again in his boat. And after the crowd has gone, he says to Peter, put your boats out and throw your nets out. And Peter's like, what's the point? We were doing it all night. We caught nothing. And they catch a lot. And I realized in that moment, God was saying to me about the feast, you need to cast your net wider. And I shared this with my Muslim member of staff, who was so moved by this. She said, that's amazing. And she shared something from the Quran, and that's the space. And I think that's amazing. I'm not afraid to talk about how God speaks to me, to friends of other faith, but I'm not doing it in an evangelistic kind of way, but God's working in that space.
Yeah.
I've got the best job in the world.
Yeah. And honestly, if people are exploring, if the Holy Spirit is nudging them, if they have a friend like you who they've been having those conversations, those spiritual conversations with, who better would they come and talk to? Who better? How much more so would those people be interested in knowing Jesus more or knowing more about Jesus because of those conversations? But equally, God works through all of it, like he works in the conversations, in the relationships, if people stay where they are. Like God has us all on our own journey. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I want to, you've mentioned Birmingham a few times, and I'm wondering if people are listening to this and they're in London or they're in another country, can they access and get involved with the feast? Can they find out about how you do it and do it in their location? What's the situation?
Absolutely. So in the UK, we have 3 hubs. So we're in Birmingham, although we describe ourselves as the West Midlands now because our reach is huge in the West Midlands. We've got a hub in Luton and one in Tower Hamlets in London. We also have partner organisations across the world. In fact, we have a sister organisation in Beirut. So they have their guidelines for dialogue. So they're the closest to the feast, and they do the most amazing work in far more challenging circumstances than we have over here, particularly at the moment. But they're just the most amazing organisation, bringing Muslim and Christian young people together, even in the middle of war, which is really quite something. But yes, so we're only a small organisation, so we're really keen to, through our resources, through training, through conversation, to support people who want to do this. We can't do it everywhere that we'd like to, but in the last few years I've been in Denmark, I've been in Chicago, we've done online work with Sweden, with Latvia, with Australia. So there is training available. We've got some online training just on our guidelines for dialogue coming up in June, which you can access through our shop on our website. We're always really keen to teach people how to use the guidelines for dialogue in their situation, how to help young people become more confident in their faith and identity through coming together with young people from different faiths. And actually, increasingly, I'm learning from so many Christian organisations that the situation their young people is in is that they are in a school that is so diverse. And you know, in those diverse places, Christian young people find it easier to hide than to stand up and say, this is who I am. So they don't have necessarily an identifying feature that says they're a Christian. So really, yes. So the answer is there are hubs around the country that you can talk to. People can give us a call and say, can you deliver a training? Can we just talk about how we can deliver this here? I had a chaplain from a school in Sussex phone me and say, I want to start an interfaith club. Can you give me some guidance? And we sent him some resources and gave him some advice on how to do that. So always really open to help people do this, because we know that it is transformative for young people. And you know, you can, our website has a resources page that's got the guidelines, so you can download those. You don't have to pay for those, but we're keen for people to use them right and to use them with the right intention. Those conversations with us are always really welcome. Just an aside, for Christian youth workers, we've got a resource called Building Bridges, which it enables young Christians using the guidelines for dialogue to answer some of those questions about, what do I believe about? There are 11 units, carry a number of different Bible studies. You can deliver it in 20 minutes or an hour and a half. You pick and choose. But it's just making sure that also Christian young people are given that opportunity to think, what does the Bible say about this? And what, you know, not to tell them what to believe, but to help them on their own personal journey of faith, so that when they're asked a question by a friend of a different faith, they actually feel that they have that confidence to speak into that.
So interesting. And can you tell us your website?
Yes, it's thefeast.org.
Great. Well, I will put links in the show notes so that people can find all of those things and the resources that you mentioned. Thank you so much, Jill, for sharing the journey, sharing about Feast. I think it's quite unique. It probably shouldn't be unique, but I think it is quite a unique ministry and charity. And yeah, let's pray that these guidelines stop being so unique and get more adopted, because I think, as you say, they would transform the way we live, the way we interact with each other, and I think the way we share faith. So thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
One thing I've taken away from this conversation is the power of helping young people know you don't need to be afraid to talk about your faith. And the way we do it is by listening well and asking good questions. Links to the Feast's resources that Jill mentioned are in the show notes. Roots is committed to helping you lead a great church that's growing, relevant, engaging, authentic, and together. An annual subscription to Roots will help your church, and young people in particular, grow deeper in their knowledge of the Bible and how to live it out. You can search our website by Bible passage, by lectionary week, or by theme for engaging sessions and ideas that help you open up conversations, understand the context of Bible passages, and reflect on how the Bible and our faith is relevant today and should impact how we live. Our Knowledge Hub articles and Discovering God sessions offer insight on tough topics like how the Bible was compiled, forgiveness, the environment, or violence in Scripture. Head to rootsforchurches.com to find out more or take out a free trial. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and share it with your friends and network, and leave us a review so that others can find it. Together, we can grow.